With her last drop of fuel and a heart full of fragile hope, Clara pulled her rattling sedan onto the overgrown path leading to the farmhouse. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Beside her, her 7-year-old son, Leo, pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging the window as he stared at their new home. It was more dilapidated than the pictures had shown, with paint peeling like sunburnt skin and a porch that sagged with the weight of forgotten years. But for Clara, it was a sanctuary, a promise whispered on the wind. This ramshackle structure, purchased with every last cent she had, was the foundation upon which she would rebuild their lives, far from the city's relentless noise and the ghosts of a life she was desperate to leave behind. She turned off the engine, and the sudden silence of the countryside enveloped them, a stark contrast to the constant hum of their past. Clara took a deep, steadying breath, the key to the front door feeling heavy and monumental in her palm. This was more than a transaction. It was an act of faith. She envisioned a garden where weeds now reigned, imagined Leo's laughter echoing in rooms that were currently dark and silent. This property wasn't just land and wood, it was a canvas for a future she had to believe in, a place where her resilience could finally take root and grow. She saw past the broken shutters and the tangled vines, focusing instead on the sturdy bones of the house, a symbol of the strength she was determined to find within herself for her son's sake. Taking Leo's small hand in hers, Clara walked up the creaking steps of the porch. The old wooden door groaned in protest as she turned the key, the sound echoing like a sigh through the still air. As the door swung inward, a smell hit her that was entirely wrong. It wasn't the expected scent of dust, mold, and abandonment. Instead, there was a faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke and something savory, like a recently cooked meal. The air felt settled, lived in. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a cold dread seeping into her veins. Through the grimy windows, slivers of afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a makeshift bed in the corner and a dirty plate resting on a crate, clear signs that her sanctuary was not as empty as she believed. From the shadows of an adjoining room, a man emerged, his movements slow and weary. He was not a menacing figure, but his face was a mask of profound exhaustion, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible, crushing weight. Behind him, seated in a threadbare armchair, was a frail, elderly man, his gaze distant and unfocused, lost in a world only he could see. In that instant, Clara's dream of a peaceful new beginning shattered. A primal wave of fear and righteous anger washed over her. This was her house, her one chance at stability, and it had been violated. Her hand instinctively tightened around her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, ready to reclaim what was legally and rightfully hers from these strangers who had trespassed on her hope. But she paused. The younger man didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, not as a threat, but as a silent, desperate plea. His eyes, filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible, flickered towards the old man, who was now humming a soft, tuneless melody. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, caught in a silent standoff between her rights and a story she did not yet understand. The very foundation of her new life was being challenged not by malice, but by a heartbreaking mystery that hung heavy in the air. She had come to this forgotten place to build a home, never imagining she would first have to decide whether or not to destroy one. Little did she know, her decision in the next few moments would change the course of all their lives forever. Clara's fingers tightened around the cold plastic of her phone, the screen glowing with an authority she no longer felt. Her mind raced, picturing flashing blue and red lights cutting through the twilight, the harsh voices of officers echoing in the quiet countryside, and the humiliation of these two strangers being led away. She glanced down at Leo, who was now clutching her coat, his wide eyes darting from the strange men to his mother's face, searching for a cue on how to feel. Her fierce, primal instinct to protect her son, to secure this one small piece of the world she had fought so hard for, was at war with an unexpected wave of empathy. The younger man's shoulders were so heavily slumped, his gaze so utterly defeated, that he seemed less like a threat and more like a man already broken by a battle she couldn't see. Her attention shifted to the elderly man, Arthur, who remained oblivious in his worn armchair. He was gently rocking back and forth, humming a soft, fragmented melody that seemed to rise from a deep well of memory. A faint, wistful smile played on his lips as his clouded eyes traced the patterns of dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. He was a ghost in his own life, a fragile figure completely untethered from the tense reality of the room. Clara noticed the tenderness in his surroundings, the carefully mended tear in the blanket across his lap, a worn book of poems placed on a crate beside him as if he might reach for it at any moment. These were not the signs of a careless intruder. They were the unmistakable artifacts of love, of a desperate, patient care that resonated with her own maternal heart. The younger man finally broke the suffocating silence, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to carry the weight of countless sleepless nights. "Please," he began, his eyes pleading with a sincerity that pierced through Clara's fear. "My name is Samuel. This is my father, Arthur. We can't go yet." He gestured helplessly around the dusty room. "He thinks my mother is still in the kitchen, baking his favorite apple pie. He was born in the bedroom upstairs. Every morning he wakes up and looks out that window, just like he has for 80 years. Samuel's confession was not an excuse. It was a quiet, heartbreaking testament to a love that defied logic and law, a son's desperate attempt to shield his father from a final, devastating truth. Clara's perception of the farmhouse began to fundamentally change. The peeling paint and creaking floors were no longer just signs of neglect. They were the scars of a long and storied life. She saw the faint, ghostly outlines on the walls where generations of family photographs must have hung, their faded squares mapping a lineage of joy and sorrow. The scent of wood smoke was not the smell of squatters, but the lingering soul of a family hearth that had warmed this home for decades. Her own dream, the one she had carried here like a fragile seed, suddenly felt intrusive and brash. She had come to build a future on the ruins of someone else's past, never once considering that the ghosts of that past were still very much alive, clinging to the only world they had ever known. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like a surrender, Clara slowly lowered her hand. The phone in her palm suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a weapon she could not bring herself to wield. She took a single, deliberate step across the threshold, the sound of her shoe on the dusty floorboard echoing like a verdict. She met Samuel's weary eyes, offering not a solution, but a silent acknowledgement of his pain. In that moment, she made a choice that went against every instinct for self-preservation. She chose to listen. She chose to see the human beings before her instead of the problem they represented. The foundation of her new life was being tested before she had even laid the first stone, and she was discovering it would be built not on ownership, but on an act of profound and terrifying grace. The chill of the autumn evening began to seep through the farmhouse's thin walls, but inside, a fragile warmth was kindled by an unlikely truce. Clara, using a small camping stove she had packed, heated 2 cans of vegetable soup. The simple, savory aroma filled the dusty air, a scent of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. They sat in a small circle of flickering candlelight, the shadows dancing on the walls like old ghosts. Samuel gently helped his father. Arthur with each spoonful, his movements patient and practiced. Leo, now nestled beside his mother, ate his soup with a quiet curiosity. his earlier fear melting away in the face of this shared, simple ritual. In the dim light, they were not owner and trespassers. They were just four souls huddled together against the encroaching darkness, sharing what little they had in a house that held all of their uncertain futures. After their meager dinner, Leo, emboldened by the quiet calm, slid off his chair and approached the elderly man. He held out a small, worn wooden car, a treasure he had kept clutched in his pocket. "Do you want to see?" he whispered, his voice soft in the still room. Arthur, who had been staring blankly at the wall, slowly turned his head. His clouded eyes seemed to focus for a fleeting moment on the toy, and then on the small boy offering it. A faint, slow smile spread across his weathered face as he reached out a trembling hand and gently brushed his fingers over the car. For that brief instant, a flicker of light returned to his eyes, a connection to the present. Samuel watched, his breath caught in his throat, a look of profound, grateful sorrow on his face that touched Clara to her very core. As the night deepened, Leo fell asleep on a bed of coats Clara had arranged on the floor. His soft breathing a steady rhythm in the quiet house. With the child asleep, a different kind of silence fell between the two adults, one that invited confidence. Samuel finally began to speak, his voice low and raspy with exhaustion and unshed tears. He spoke of his mother, how she used to hum in the kitchen, and how the scent of her apple pies would fill every room. He pointed to a notch on a doorframe, marking the day he was finally taller than his father. He wasn't just describing a house. He was painting a portrait of a life, of a love so deeply rooted in the soil beneath them that it was impossible to separate the family from the place. Clara listened, not as a landlord, but as a mother who understood the desperate need to create a sanctuary for those you love. Yet as Samuel shared these tender memories, a subtle veil was drawn over certain topics. When Clara gently asked how they had lost the farm, his narrative faltered. He spoke in vague terms of a bad investment and promises that weren't kept, his gaze drifting towards the dark windows, avoiding her eyes. A flicker of something that looked like shame, or perhaps a deep-seated anger, crossed his features before he quickly masked it. He mentioned a cousin, a name dropped and then quickly retracted, leaving an unanswered question hanging in the air. Clara sensed a wound far deeper and more complex than a simple foreclosure. There was a secret buried beneath the story of financial ruin, a piece of the puzzle that Samuel was either unable or unwilling to share, and its weight was palpable in the room. Later, as a sliver of moon rose in the sky, Clara retrieved a thick wool blanket from her car and brought it inside. She walked over to Samuel and held it out. He looked from the blanket to her face, his eyes filled with a weary astonishment. He hadn't expected this. No words were exchanged, but as his fingers brushed against hers while taking the blanket, a silent pact was formed. For tonight, and perhaps for a few more nights to come, they would be allies in this strange, shared limbo. After she lay down beside her sleeping son, Clara stared into the darkness, listening to the house breathe around her. She heard the soft rustle as Samuel draped the blanket over his father, followed by a quiet, shuddering sigh. She had come here seeking a foundation of solid ground, and instead she found herself on a precipice, wondering if this act of compassion was building a bridge or leading them all to a steeper fall. The following morning, a fragile peace settled over the farmhouse, bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. While Leo explored the overgrown yard, Clara found herself drawn to a dusty wooden chest tucked away in a corner of the living room. Lifting the heavy lid, she discovered a collection of old photo albums, their leather covers cracked with age. As she carefully turned the brittle pages, a visual history of the family unfolded before her. Black and white portraits of stern-faced ancestors, faded color snapshots of birthday parties on the lawn, and a recurring image of two young boys, brothers in all but blood, playing beneath the same ancient oak tree she could see from the window. Samuel entered the room silently, his face tightening as he saw the open album in her hands. He took a deep, ragged breath, the kind one takes before diving into cold, dark water, and finally began to speak the truth he had so carefully guarded. It wasn't a bank or some faceless corporation that took this place from us, Samuel began, his voice low and strained, thick with the bitterness of a memory he had replayed 1,000 times. It was my cousin, Richard, the other boy in those pictures. He explained that Richard had been more like a brother to him, raised alongside him after his own parents passed away. A few years ago, Richard had approached them with a grand plan, a way to save the struggling farm by investing in a new organic farming venture. He was charismatic and convincing, painting a vivid picture of a prosperous future that would honor their family's legacy. He offered to handle all the complicated financial arrangements, asking only for Arthur's trust and his signature on what he claimed were loan applications for the business, a simple formality to secure their future. The story then took its dark, inevitable turn. Samuel recounted the sickening realization that Richard's promises were a carefully constructed web of lies. The documents Arthur signed were not for a business loan, but a transfer of equity and a power of attorney that gave Richard complete control. He had systematically mortgaged the farm to its absolute limit, siphoning the money into offshore accounts and funding a life of luxury they couldn't have imagined. All the while, he presented them with fake investment reports and cheerful updates on a project that never existed. Samuel described the day the first official foreclosure notice arrived in the mail, the cold, impersonal, legal language feeling like a physical blow. The ground beneath their feet, the very soil that held generations of their history, had been stolen from them by the one person they believed would never betray their trust. The true devastation, Samuel confessed, was not the loss of the land, but the loss of his father. The shock of Richard's betrayal was a blow from which Arthur's mind never recovered. It was as if the cruelty of the act shattered his connection to the present, sending him retreating into the safer, kinder world of his memories, a world where his wife was still alive and his home was still his. Samuel spoke of his own overwhelming guilt, the feeling that he should have seen it, should have protected his father from the coming storm. He had fought a losing legal battle, exhausted his savings, and worked until he was hollowed out by fatigue, but it was too late. He was left with nothing but a broken-hearted father who no longer recognized the world around him, and a profound, aching shame for failing to defend their legacy. Clara listened, her own hardships and struggles suddenly feeling distant, eclipsed by the sheer, calculated cruelty of this story. She looked over at Arthur, who was now sitting on the porch. His face turned towards the morning sun, humming softly to himself. She finally understood the depth of Samuel's desperation, the fierce, protective love that drove him to commit this act of defiance. He wasn't just trying to give his father a peaceful end. He was trying to hold together the last remaining fragments of a world that had been violently ripped apart. As Samuel's voice trailed off into a heavy silence, a profound sense of hopelessness settled between them. But what Samuel didn't know, as he stared at the floor in defeat, was that the name Richard Thorne had just struck a chord deep within Clara's own memory, a chilling connection to a painful chapter from her own past she had tried desperately to forget. The name Richard Thorne hung in the air between them, not as a simple name, but as a chilling echo from a life Clara had fought to bury. It was a name branded onto her past, a scar she traced in the dark of night. The blood drained from her face, and the rustic farmhouse suddenly felt like a cage, its walls closing in on her. Samuel, lost in his own painful recollection, didn't immediately notice the profound shift in her demeanor. Her breath hitched, her mind racing to connect an impossible coincidence. She had to be certain. With a voice that was barely a tremor, a fragile whisper that threatened to break, she asked him, "But this cousin, Richard, what did he look like?" a question that felt less like a query and more like the turning of a key in a lock she never wanted to open again. Samuel, blinking back to the present, seemed surprised by her question but answered without hesitation. He described a man with a disarming smile and eyes that promised the world, a man whose charisma was a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. As he spoke, he walked over to the dusty mantelpiece and picked up a silver-framed photograph that had been turned face down. He wiped a layer of grime from the glass and held it out to her. "This was from the last family reunion, before everything went wrong," he said softly. Clara took the frame with a trembling hand. There, smiling back at her, was a younger, happier Arthur. An unknown woman she assumed was Samuel's mother, and standing between them, with his arm slung casually over Samuel's shoulder, was the ghost of her own life. It was him, Richard Thorne, her ex-husband, the father of her son. The air left her lungs in a silent, strangled gasp. The photograph slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor and shattering the glass. Her entire world reconfigured itself in that single, horrific instant. This house, this sanctuary she had purchased with the very last of her money from a bitter divorce settlement she had fought tooth and nail for, was not just a random property. It was the ancestral home of a family her ex-husband had systematically destroyed. The cruel, poetic injustice of it was a physical blow. She had, in the most literal sense, bought the wreckage of Richard's other life. She had escaped one fire only to land in the smouldering embers of another he had set. And her son was now sleeping peacefully under the roof that should have belonged to the man beside her. A wave of nausea washed over her. She looked from the shattered picture on the floor to Samuel's confused and concerned face, and the words tumbled out, raw and broken. "That man," she choked out, pointing a shaking finger at the image. "Richard Thorne. He is my ex-husband. He is Leo's father." The confession fell into the stunned silence of the room. A revelation so improbable, it felt like a line from a fever dream. Samuel stared at her, his mind struggling to process the impossible connection. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in dawning horror as the pieces clicked into place. The woman who had shown him unexpected kindness was inextricably linked to the man who had caused him the ultimate suffering. They were not strangers bound by a chance encounter. They were two victims of the same predator. Their separate tragedies now irrevocably intertwined. The fragile bond of trust they had carefully constructed over the past day shattered like the glass on the floor. The farmhouse was no longer a symbol of hope or a haven of memory. It was now a monument to Richard's far-reaching cruelty, a physical nexus of their shared pain. Clara and Samuel stood on opposite sides of the room, separated by a chasm of betrayal that was not of their own making. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not just sorrow in his eyes, but a flicker of suspicion, a new and terrible question. Was she a part of this? Did she know? The very air between them grew heavy and toxic, thick with the poison of a past that had just caught up to them both, and in the suffocating silence, the future had never seemed more impossible. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, poisoning the fragile peace they had built. Samuel took a half-step back, his body recoiling as if she had physically struck him. The weariness in his eyes, which had once evoked her sympathy, now morphed into a cold, hard glare of accusation. Every ounce of kindness she had shown him was instantly recontextualized, twisted into something sinister in the light of this new, monstrous truth. He looked from her face to her son, Leo, who was now awake and watching them with wide, confused eyes. In Samuel's gaze, Clara no longer saw a fellow victim, but an accomplice, an extension of the man who had ruined them. He saw the money from his family's stolen legacy embodied in this woman and her child, who now stood as the legal owners of his entire world, the final, bitter inheritors of his family's destruction. A torrent of emotions crashed over Clara. Shame, fury, and a profound sense of injustice. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words sounding feeble and inadequate even to her own ears. "Samuel, you have to believe me. He destroyed my life too. This money, it was all I had left after I escaped from him." Her plea was desperate, a raw appeal for him to see beyond the impossible coincidence to the shared pain beneath. But her words were like stones thrown against a fortress wall. His face remained a mask of betrayal, his jaw set in a rigid line of unforgiving silence. She felt a surge of wounded pride. She had chosen compassion over her own security, offering grace to strangers in her home, only to be judged for a connection she had spent years trying to sever. She was being punished for a past she had not chosen. He finally broke the silence, his voice devoid of any of its previous warmth, now sharp and brittle like shattering ice. "So this is how it ends," he said, not looking at her, but at the faded wallpaper, at the ghosts of his memories. "He takes our past, our future, our dignity, and then he sends his family to pick over the bones." The accusation was brutally unfair, but it was born from a wound so deep that it had poisoned his perspective. He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality that cut her more deeply than any shout could have. He walked out onto the porch where his father sat, oblivious, humming his soft tune. By positioning himself beside Arthur, Samuel created a clear and painful boundary. He was with his family, his history, and she was the outsider, the enemy who had trespassed in more ways than one. Left alone in the living room with the shattered photograph at her feet, Clara felt the full weight of her decision collapse upon her. The farmhouse, which had briefly felt like a shared sanctuary, now seemed to mock her with its silent testimony to a tragedy she was inextricably a part of. Every creak of the floorboards, every mote of dust dancing in the sunbeams, felt like an accusation. Her dream of a simple, peaceful life was now a nightmarish tangle of another family's sorrow. She had wanted to be a rescuer, a provider of comfort, but fate had cast her as the villain in someone else's story. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to pack up her car and drive away from this house of pain and leave the ghosts to their rightful owners. But she had nowhere else to go. As the afternoon sun cast long, mournful shadows across the room, Samuel came back inside. He moved with a cold, detached purpose, avoiding her gaze entirely as he began to quietly gather their few belongings. The worn blanket, his father's book of poems, a small canvas bag. His actions were a clear and devastating statement. They were leaving. He was choosing to take his father away from the only place that brought him peace rather than share it with her. Clara watched, her heart fracturing with each item he packed. All the empathy, the shared meals, the fragile connection. It was all being erased by the crushing weight of pride and pain. She stood frozen, caught in a terrible dilemma. Should she let him walk away, severing their connection forever, or fight for a forgiveness that felt utterly impossible to grant? As Samuel stood silhouetted in the doorway, a bag of memories in his hand, a small figure moved from the shadows. It was Leo. He walked directly to Samuel, his small face a mask of serious concern, and tugged gently on the man's worn jeans. The world seemed to hold its breath. "Are you leaving because of my mommy?" he asked, his voice clear and steady in the tense silence. Samuel looked down, his heart clenching at the boy's innocent question. Before he could form a reply, Leo continued, his words landing with the force of a physical blow. "My other daddy used to make her cry like that before he went away." The simple, devastating parallel shattered Samuel's armor of rage. He wasn't looking at the son of his enemy. He was looking at his nephew, a child who had witnessed the same poison from the very same source. The bag slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a soft, final thud. The anger drained out of Samuel like a fever breaking, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. He finally looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and saw past the impossible coincidence to the shared geography of their pain. He saw the sleepless nights etched under her eyes, the defensive posture of a woman who had fought too many battles alone, the same profound weariness that he saw in his own reflection every morning. The rigid line of his jaw softened, and his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in a quiet, heartbreaking surrender to a truth he had refused to see. "He did this to you, too," Samuel whispered, the words a statement of fact, not a question. It was a raw, vulnerable admission of his own blindness, a recognition that they were not on opposite sides of a war, but were, in fact, the two sole survivors of the same shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of wreckage. Clara took a tentative step towards him, her own defensiveness melting away in the face of his broken acknowledgement. The tears she had been holding back finally welled in her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, unexpected relief. "He takes everything from everyone, Samuel. That's what he does," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This money," she gestured around the room, at the house that was both her dream and his history. "It feels dirty. It's his money. Stolen from you and from others like us. I don't want it to be the foundation of my son's future. I want it to be the beginning of his justice." A fierce, protective light ignited in her gaze. "Don't leave. Stay here. Let's use the very thing he values most, his money, to take back what he stole from your father. This isn't just my house anymore. It's our evidence. It's our fortress." A profound stillness settled over Samuel as he absorbed her words. Her offer was more than a truce. It was a declaration of alliance, a radical act of restorative justice that he had never dared to imagine. He looked over at his father, who had dozed off on the porch, a peaceful smile on his face, as if he were dreaming of a kinder past. He then looked back at Clara and Leo, this small, broken family that fate had so cruelly and miraculously delivered to his doorstep. He saw not an enemy, but a partner. He saw not a painful reminder of his loss, but the only possible path toward reclaiming his family's honor. With a slow, deliberate nod, he sealed their pact. "Okay," he said, the single word carrying the weight of forgiveness, acceptance, and a dawning, fragile hope. He bent down, not to pick up the bag he had dropped, but to push it back into the corner, out of the way. Later that evening, the flickering candlelight once again filled the room. But this time it cast no long, menacing shadows. Instead, it illuminated a scene of quiet collaboration. Spread across the old wooden table between them were not plates of soup, but the tattered legal documents Samuel had saved, and the pristine divorce settlement papers Clara had brought. They sat side by side, their heads bent together, tracing the lines of deceit and searching for a path to truth. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees. But inside the farmhouse, a profound calm had settled. The house was no longer a place of conflict or ownership, but a shared sanctuary, its old walls embracing the beginning of their unified fight. It was a home being rebuilt not with wood and nails, but with the unbreakable mortar of forgiveness and a shared, unwavering purpose. Months later, the harsh chill of autumn had surrendered to the gentle promise of spring. The farmhouse, once a monument to neglect and sorrow, was now thrumming with a quiet, determined life. The peeling paint had been scraped away, replaced by a fresh coat of warm yellow that seemed to soak up the morning sun. Samuel, his shoulders no longer stooped by the weight of despair, worked to mend the sagging porch, the rhythmic sound of his hammer a steady heartbeat for their new beginning. Clara, her hands finding a familiar comfort in the rich soil, cultivated a small garden where tangled weeds once grew, planting seeds of vegetables and hope. The legal battle against Richard was a slow, arduous process moving in the background, but the true restoration was happening here, in the daily acts of rebuilding a place and the lives within it. Their shared work was a silent language of healing, transforming the scars of the past into the foundation of a shared future. The most profound transformation, however, was in the bonds that had taken root inside the house. Leo, who had arrived as a timid observer, was now the keeper of Arthur's stories. He would sit for hours by the old man's chair, reading aloud from the worn book of poems, his young voice giving new life to the fading words. On good days, a light of recognition would flicker in Arthur's eyes, and he would whisper a line of a half-forgotten verse, a fleeting bridge between his lost world and the present. Samuel and Clara had forged a partnership that transcended their shared trauma, built on quiet understanding and mutual respect. They were two solitary souls who, through an impossible twist of fate, had discovered they were not alone. They found in each other a quiet strength, a silent ally in the long and patient work of mending a family fractured by betrayal. Clara often found herself looking at the official deed to the property, the crisp paper that declared her the legal owner. In the beginning, that document had represented her entire world, a symbol of security, independence, and a desperate grasp at stability. Now, it felt like a relic from a different life. She had come here seeking a plot of land to call her own, but she had found something infinitely more valuable. The true architecture of a home, she realized, was not built with wood and nails, but with the invisible pillars of empathy, forgiveness, and shared vulnerability. For sometimes, what we believe to be a dead end is merely the universe gently rerouting us to a path we were always meant to find. The house was no longer a possession. It had become a living, breathing testament to the idea that a home is not a place you own, but a space you earn through acts of the heart. The news, Gadeen, when it finally came, arrived not with a dramatic bang, but with the quiet finality of a closing door. A letter from their lawyer confirmed that Richard's web of deceit had fully unraveled. With the evidence they provided, a clear line drawn from his cruelty to his father to his callousness with his own son, the authorities had frozen his stolen assets. The farm would be returned, its title cleared of the stain of his greed. But the victory felt secondary, a quiet postscript to the real story. The true justice had not been found in a courtroom, but in the living room of the farmhouse, in the moment two strangers chose to see each other's pain instead of their own. The legal win simply affirmed what they had already built, a sanctuary founded not on a legal document, but on a radical act of grace that had disarmed the power of a heartless man. As a warm evening sun cast a golden glow across the fields, the four of them sat together on the newly finished porch. Arthur, wrapped in a warm blanket, watched with a rare, lucid smile as Leo showed him a ladybug crawling on a leaf. Samuel stood beside Clara, their shoulders lightly touching, a comfortable silence passing between them that was filled with everything that had been said and everything that no longer needed to be. The farmhouse stood proudly behind them, no longer a place of ghosts, but a beacon of resilience, its windows reflecting the warm light of the setting sun. A home is not defined by the name on its deed, but by the kindness that lives within its walls. If you believe that compassion has the power to rebuild any broken foundation, share this story, for it is in these connections that we find where we truly belong.